Hello, and welcome to The Psychology of Murder, a podcast by Keisha Wilson. Today, we'll be talking about one of the big-ticket psychology items, schizophrenia. There's a lot to cover about this disorder, and it's important that I do it right. I honestly don't feel qualified to talk about this, but I will do my very best. There's a lot of stigma surrounding the disease that just isn't true. There also aren't enough conversations going on about it. Society tends to shy away from things they don't know or understand, and schizophrenia is definitely hard to understand. But I can do my part and help you at least know a little more about it. There is an entire section in the DSM-5 dedicated to schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. Some of the related diagnoses are schizotypal personality disorder, delusional disorder, brief psychotic disorder, schizophreniform disorder, schizophrenia, of course, schizoaffective disorder, which I will also be briefly covering in this episode, substance/medication-induced psychotic disorder, and psychotic disorder due to another medical condition. I wanted to make note here the use of the term schizophrenia spectrum. You may not have heard of schizophrenia being on a spectrum before, but chances are you have heard about autism spectrum disorder. I thought I would take a moment to mention that there is beginning to be a push toward making psychological diagnoses on spectrums as opposed to the hard cut, you have it or you don't. While the DSM-5 is considered to be the holy grail of psychological diagnoses, there is starting to be a debate as to whether or not the way they approach diagnosis is the best way. Personally, I love the idea of having more psychological illnesses on a spectrum or scale. I think it makes more sense and can lead to answers for a lot more people. I feel like just because you're missing one diagnostic criteria for a disorder shouldn't mean that the diagnosis for that disorder is completely off the table. For example, when I had appendicitis, I never ran a fever or threw up. Those are two of the hallmark symptoms of appendicitis, and I never had either one. But that didn't mean I didn't have it. Anyway, let's get back to the topic of the day. Schizophrenia is one of the hardest psychological disorders to have. It also has one of the highest rates of suicide compared to any other mental illness. This disease can tear families and friends apart. It is devastating, and there is no cure. While there are treatment options, it is difficult for people with schizophrenia to be consistent and stay on their medication. I'll go into further detail on this here in a little bit. But first, let's start with the DSM-5 definition of schizophrenia. I will be reading this directly from the DSM-5 in order to ensure the greatest amount of accuracy that I can. The specific DSM-5 criteria for schizophrenia are as follows. The presence of two or more of the following, each present for a significant portion of time during a 1-month period, or less if successfully treated, with at least one of them being number 1, 2, or 3. Number 1 is delusions. Delusions are defined as fixed beliefs that are not amendable to change in light of conflicting evidence. Their content may include a variety of themes, for example, persecutory, referential, somatic, religious, grandiose. Persecutory delusions, the belief that one is going to be harmed, harassed, and so forth by an individual, organization, or other group are most common. Referential delusions, the belief that certain gestures, comments, environmental cues, and so forth are directed at oneself, are also common. Grandiose delusions, when an individual believes that he or she has exceptional abilities, wealth, or fame. And erotomantic delusions, for example, when an individual believes falsely that another person is in love with him or her, are also seen. Nihilistic delusions involve the conviction that a major catastrophe will occur, and somatic delusions focus on preoccupations regarding health and organ function. Delusions are deemed bizarre if they are clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers and do not derive from ordinary life experiences. An example of a bizarre delusion is the belief that an outside force has removed his or her internal organs and replaced them with someone else's organs without leaving any wounds or scars. An example of a non-bizarre delusion is the belief that one is under surveillance by the police despite a lack of convincing evidence. Delusions that express a loss of control over mind or body are generally considered to be bizarre. These include the belief that one's thoughts have been removed by some outside force, thought withdrawal, that alien thoughts have been put into one's mind, thought insertion, or that one's body or actions are being acted on or manipulated by some outside force, delusions of control. The distinction between a delusion and a strongly held idea is sometimes difficult to make and depends in part on the degree of conviction with which the belief is held, despite clear or reasonable contradictory evidence regarding its veracity. Number 2, hallucinations, which are perception-like experiences that occur without an external stimulus. They are vivid and clear, with the full force and impact of normal perceptions, and not under voluntary control. They may occur in any sensory modality, but auditory hallucinations are the most common in schizophrenia and related disorders. Auditory hallucinations are usually experienced as voices, whether familiar or unfamiliar, that are perceived as distinct from the individual's own thoughts. The hallucinations must occur in the context of a clear sensorium. Those that occur while falling asleep, hypnagogic, or waking up, hypnopompic, are considered to be within the range of normal experience. Hallucinations may be a normal part of religious experience in certain cultural contexts. Number 3 is disorganized thinking or speech. Disorganized thinking, or formal thought disorder, is typically inferred from the individual's speech. The individual may switch from one topic to another, derailment or loose associations. Answers to questions may be obliquely related or completely unrelated, tangentiality. Rarely, speech may be so severely disorganized that it is nearly incomprehensible and resembles receptive aphasia in its linguistic disorganization, incoherence, or word salad. Because mildly disorganized speech is common and nonspecific, the symptom must be severe enough to substantially impair effective communication. The severity of the impairment may be difficult to evaluate if the person making the diagnosis comes from a different linguistic background than that of the person being examined. Less severe disorganized thinking or speech may occur during the prodromal and residual period of schizophrenia. Number 4 is grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. Grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior may manifest itself in a variety of ways, ranging from childlike silliness to unpredictable agitation. Problems may be noted in any form of goal-directed behavior, leading to difficulties in performing activities of daily living. Catatonic behavior is a marked decrease in reactivity to the environment. This ranges from resistance to instructions, negativism, to maintaining a rigid, inappropriate, or bizarre posture, to a complete lack of verbal and motor response, mutism and stupor. It can also include purposeless and excessive motor activity without obvious cause, catatonic excitement. Other features are repeated stereotyped movements, staring, grimacing, mutism, and the echoing of speech. Although catatonia has historically been associated with schizophrenia, catatonic symptoms are nonspecific and may occur in other mental disorders, for example, bipolar or depressive disorders with catatonia, and in medical conditions such as catatonic disorder due to another medical condition. Number 5 is negative symptoms. Negative symptoms account for a substantial portion of the morbidity associated with schizophrenia, but are less prominent in other psychotic disorders. 2 negative symptoms are particularly prominent in schizophrenia: diminished emotional expression and avolition. Diminished emotional expression includes reductions in the expressions of emotions in the face, eye contact, intonation of speech, and movements of the hand, head, and face that normally give an emotional emphasis to speech. Avolition is a decrease in motivated, self-initiated, purposeful activities. The individual may sit for long periods of time and show little interest in participating in work or social activities. Other negative symptoms include alogia, anhedonia, and asociality. Agolia is manifested by diminished speech output. Anhedonia is the decreased ability to experience pleasure from a positive stimuli or degradation in the recollection of pleasure previously experienced. Asociality refers to the apparent lack of interest in social interactions and may be associated with avolition, but it can be a manifestation of limited opportunities for social interactions. Criteria B. For a significant portion of the time since the onset of the disturbance, level of functioning in one or more major areas, such as work, interpersonal relations, or self-care, is markedly below the level achieved prior to the onset, or when onset is in childhood or adolescence, there is a failure to achieve expected level of interpersonal, academic, or occupational functioning. C. Continuous signs of the disturbance persist for at least 6 months. This 6-month period must include at least 1 month of symptoms, or less if successfully treated, that meet criterion A, for example, the active phase symptoms, and may include periods of prodromal or residual symptoms. During these prodromal or residual periods, the signs of the disturbance may be manifested by only negative symptoms, by 2 or more symptoms listed in criterion A present in an attenuated form, for example, odd beliefs or unusual perceptual experiences. D. Schizoaffective disorder and depressive or bipolar disorder with psychotic features have been ruled out because either 1. No major depressive or manic episodes have occurred concurrently with the active phase symptoms, or 2. If mood episodes have occurred during active phase symptoms, they have been present for a minority of the total duration of the active and residual periods of the illness. E. The disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, for example, a drug of abuse or a medication, or another medical condition. F. If there is a history of autism spectrum disorder or a communication disorder of childhood onset, the additional diagnosis of schizophrenia is made only if prominent delusions or hallucinations, in addition to the other required symptoms of schizophrenia, are also present for at least 1 month or less if successfully treated. Some associated features with schizophrenia that are not required for the diagnosis but can support it. These include inappropriate affect, like laughing in the absence of an appropriate stimulus, depression, anxiety, phobias, anger, a disturbed sleep pattern, such as sleeping during the day and being active at night, a lack of interest in food or eating, depersonalization, derealization, and somatic, or relating to the body, concerns that can reach delusional levels. Let's also note here that the onset of symptoms can be either sudden or gradual. Cognitive deficits are common in schizophrenia and include slow processing speed, decreased declarative memory, working memory, and language function. There can also be abnormalities in sensory processing and social cognitive deficits, including not being able to infer the intentions of other people and the tendency to attribute irrelevant events as significant, which can help explain the foundations of their delusions. People who are diagnosed with schizophrenia often are not aware that there is anything wrong with them. This tends to be more of a symptom of schizophrenia as opposed to a coping strategy to handle the diagnosis, as some may think. It is because of this unawareness that makes treatment adherence so hard for this disorder. If they don't think there's anything off, why do they need to treat it? This often leads to poor outcomes for the individual, including higher relapse rates, increased number of involuntary treatments, poorer psychosocial functioning, aggression, and a poorer course of illness. This is a rare disorder. Estimates of its prevalence range from 0.3 to 0.7% of the population, although that concentration can be higher under certain demographics. There is evidence to suggest that schizophrenia is overdiagnosed in African American and Hispanic populations. I think this goes back to the DSM-5 and it emphasizing the importance of being diagnosed by someone of the same culture, or at least with their culture taken into account. African American and Hispanic populations tend to have culture that is much different from white Americans and may be construed as a symptom of mental illness when it really isn't. Women are slightly less likely to develop schizophrenia than men. They also have a slightly different portrayal of symptoms and have an average of a later developmental age than men. Peak onset of the first psychotic episode is in the late 20s for females and early to mid-20s for males. Most people consider the age of 25 to be the sweet spot for developing schizophrenia. Onset can occur outside of these ages, but it is in less frequent numbers. The diagnosis of schizophrenia in childhood is especially difficult to make. Delusions and hallucinations tend to be less elaborate than they are in adults. Plus, these can be written off as imaginative play. It is important here to rule out other, more common childhood disorders before jumping to the conclusion of schizophrenia. Psychotic symptoms do tend to decrease over the lifespan. This is likely due to the normal, age-related decline in dopamine activity, since schizophrenia is thought to be caused by a change in the level of the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin. There is evidence to support the idea that the imbalance of the two chemicals may be the basis of schizophrenia, or a change in the body's sensitivity to those neurotransmitters. While the psychotic symptoms may decrease, cognitive deficits, however, likely will not improve. There is a small number of individuals who report completely recovering from schizophrenia, but this is the exception and not the rule. It is not known why these people were able to recover, and therefore there is still not a cure for the disease. So, where does schizophrenia land on the nature versus nurture debate? Schizophrenia is primarily genetic, but the environmental risks are not zero. Having a first-degree relative with the disorder is one of the greatest risk factors. Prevalence jumps from the approximate 1% we talked about in the general population to about 10%. The risk is even higher if both parents are diagnosed with schizophrenia at 50%. If an identical twin has the condition, risk ranges between 40 and 65%. It is important to note here, kind of as a mix of nature and nurture, that when there is a genetic risk for schizophrenia, sometimes the use of drugs can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I have had multiple professors tell me about kids they knew who tried drugs, even something as simple as marijuana in college once, with a family history of schizophrenia, and then they had a sudden onset of symptoms that ruined their lives. It is unclear whether these people would still have developed schizophrenia at a later date, but please be mindful of this before you choose to take any drugs if you have a family history of schizophrenia. I find some of the environmental factors to be quite interesting here, but I also feel that these get into the causation versus correlation debate. Yes, these things may be related, but does one cause the other? Not always. Let me tell you what I mean. The DSM-5 says that the season of birth has been linked to the incidence of schizophrenia, including late winter/early spring in some locations, and summer for others. Does this mean that the time of year you were born determines your risk for schizophrenia? Most likely not. And likewise, developing schizophrenia later in life does not determine the time of year you were born. So, there is a correlation here, but not a causation. The only way to prove causation is a controlled experiment with a manipulated variable. But that would be impossible for this kind of situation. We can't control the time of year babies are born, nor can we control the development of schizophrenia. The best we can ever do here is establish a correlation, not a causation. I hope that made more sense than it did in your high school science classes. Now let's attack some of those misconceptions about schizophrenia. First of all, people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia are generally not aggressive or hostile. It is possible, but this is more likely to occur in younger males and for those who already have a history of violence prior to their diagnosis. Spontaneous attack or random assault is very uncommon. It is the exception to the rule, again, although the media seem to want to portray a different story. But I just wanted to iterate that there is no reason to be afraid of people who have schizophrenia. Like I mentioned in the intro, the suicide risk for individuals with schizophrenia is high. Approximately 5 to 6% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia commit suicide. About 20% attempt suicide on one or more occasions, and many more have significant suicidal ideation. These numbers can be even higher when their schizophrenia is paired with substance abuse or depression, which is common. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about schizoaffective disorder, which is slightly different from schizophrenia, yet distinct. Diagnostic criteria for schizoaffective disorder are as follows. A. An uninterrupted period of illness during which there is a major mood episode, major depressive or manic, concurrent with criterion A of schizophrenia. B. Delusions or hallucinations for 2 or more weeks in the absence of a major mood episode, depressive or manic, during the lifetime duration of the illness. C. Symptoms that meet criteria for a major mood episode are present for the majority of the total duration of the active and residual portions of the illness. D. The disturbance is not attributable to the effects of a substance, for example, a drug of abuse, a medication, or another medical condition. The typical age of onset of schizoaffective disorder is early adulthood, although onset can occur anywhere from adolescence to late in life. A significant number of individuals diagnosed with another psychotic illness initially will receive the diagnosis schizoaffective disorder later when the pattern of mood episodes has become more apparent. With the current diagnostic criterion C, it is expected that the diagnosis for some individuals will convert from schizoaffective disorder to another disorder as mood symptoms become less prominent. The prognosis for schizoaffective disorder is somewhat better than the prognosis for schizophrenia, but worse than the prognosis for mood disorders. Schizoaffective disorder may occur in a variety of temporal patterns. The following is a typical pattern. An individual may have pronounced auditory hallucinations and persecutory delusions for 2 months before the onset of a prominent major depressive episode. The psychotic symptoms and the full major depressive episode are then present for 3 months. Then, the individual recovers completely from the major depressive episode, but the psychotic symptoms persist for another month before they too disappear. During this period of illness, the individual's symptoms concurrently met criteria for a major depressive episode and criterion A for schizophrenia, and during the same period of illness, auditory hallucinations and delusions were present both before and after the depressive phase. The total period of illness lasted about 6 months, with psychotic symptoms alone present during the initial 2 months, both depressive and psychotic symptoms present during the next 3 months, and psychotic symptoms alone present during the last month. In this instance, the duration of the depressive episode was not brief relative to the total duration of the psychotic disturbance, and thus the presentation qualifies for a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. The expression of psychotic symptoms across the lifespan is variable. Depressive or manic symptoms can occur before the onset of psychosis, during acute psychotic episodes, during residual periods, and after cessation of psychosis. For example, an individual might present with prominent mood symptoms during the prodromal stage of schizophrenia. This pattern is not necessarily indicative of schizoaffective disorder, since it is the co-occurrence of psychotic and mood symptoms that is diagnostic. For an individual with symptoms that clearly meet the criteria for schizoaffective disorder, but who on further follow-up only presents with residual psychotic symptoms, such as subthreshold psychosis and/or prominent negative symptoms, the diagnosis may be changed to schizophrenia, as the total proportion of psychotic illness compared with mood symptoms becomes more prominent. Schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, may be more common in young adults, whereas schizoaffective disorder, depressive type, may be more common in older adults. Now let's compare and contrast the two disorders. Schizoaffective disorder is about 1/3 as common as schizophrenia, depending on which numbers you look at 0.3%. Although this is a difficult diagnosis to make, so it is possible this is underdiagnosed, but there is no way to know for sure. Schizoaffective disorder is also more common in females than males, partially because females are more prone to the depressive mood episodes. Genetic and physiological factors for developing schizoaffective disorder are similar to those of developing schizophrenia. The suicide risk is also similar, around 5%. There has to be a definite period of at least 2 weeks in which there are only psychotic symptoms, delusions and hallucinations, without mood symptoms to diagnose schizoaffective disorder. However, a major mood episode, depression or mania, is present for the majority of the total duration of the illness. Once the psychotic symptoms predominate the majority of the total duration of the illness, the diagnosis leans towards schizophrenia. Also, schizophrenia requires 6 months of prodromal or residual symptoms. Schizoaffective disorder does not require this criterion. Social dysfunction is not required for a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, nor does autism spectrum disorder need to be eliminated. I'll be honest with you, this was a difficult episode for me to cover. I feel like there's so much more to be said than can be fit into a short podcast, or even one with significant length. There could be an entire podcast dedicated specifically to schizophrenia. I hope I was able to answer some of your questions you may have had in regard to schizophrenia, but I'm worried I left you with more questions than answers. If you do have more questions, please let me know and I will do my best to address them. Thank you for listening to The Psychology of Murder. If you have suggestions for topics to cover in future episodes or have comments on this episode, please let me know. I love hearing your feedback. I'll see, or I guess hear, you later.